Does capitalism by itself rely on cultural hegemony in shaping our cultural and political identities, especially in neoliberal capitalism? This was a query sent to me, and let's explore it a little further. So I'll try to tackle this question about capitalism and cultural hegemony first by talking a little bit about Antonio Gramsci. Now, Gramsci was an Italian Marxist and was imprisoned by the fascist regime in 1926, and he remained in prison, I think, until 1937, until his death. During his time in his prison, he wrote most of his works, which were later collected and are called the prison notebooks. Before his imprisonment, he was also the founder of the Italian Communist Party and was a strong critic of Benito Mussolini, and that's why he was imprisoned. Now, it is Antonio Gramsci who theorizes through the process of his writing the concept of cultural hegemony, or just simply hegemony. Gramsci discusses that there are two ways in which the state establishes its writ or establishes itself over people or the workers. One, of course, is force or dominance. That's the mode that classical Marxists usually talked about, and that's the one they talked about when they talked about the state being a dominant and coercive institution. But for Antonio Gramsci, it's the hegemonic project that works through cultural institutions and civil society that ultimately establishes the state and its writ, not just on human bodies and their actions, but literally in the consciousness of the workers. So how does this hegemony work? It works through willing consent of the people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every person stands up and says, I consent to be governed. What it basically means is that through ideological means, through education, newspapers, cultural associations, nationalism, people give their willing consent to a governing regime. They become part of its project and then start functioning within the logic of that regime. And so that means that a political regime then mostly functions through these ideological means and not necessarily by oppressing people. This theorization of power and the consent of the governed is sort of in opposition to what the classical Marxist and even Marx employed, especially the dialectical materialism. The idea of dialectical materialism, simply stated, was that any time the mode of production shifts in history, the material conditions change, it impacts the way people interact with reality. Right? So hence Marx can theorize that as capital develops, so will the stages of workers' consciousness until we reach a point where the workers realize of their own exploitation and the proletariat then rises to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat or the rule of the workers against the capitalists. Now, the problem in that conception, there were many problems, but one of the problems which a lot of people noticed in Marx was, and they call it that Marx is fairly Hegelian in thinking of human subjectivity. And what they mean by that is that when Marx talks about alienation, for example, he posits or imagines that human beings are by their very nature productive. And they want to produce things, but they want to produce things that they love to produce. So the concept of alienated labor means that people have to do monotonous jobs in factories, repetitive jobs, which absolutely is not what they were meant to do or want to do. Hence, they are alienated from this centered self that wants to do something else. So the project of revolution then was to create disalienated labor, labor that is reconciled with their vocation. But at the center of that idea is this idealized, centered subject. Another problem in classical Marxism and later Marxism was the problem of how do the workers become aware of their own exploitation. If everything that they look at is through an ideological lens, and if that ideology is the dominant ideology of the state, how will they see beyond that ideology without that lens? So, for example, Lukács writes about it, right? Lenin famously pointed out that within the revolutionary praxis, then a vanguard would emerge, right? And the vanguard would be the people who will train others to see the reality as it is and not see it through the ideology of the dominant class. This vanguard is eventually replaced by the Communist Party, the Central Communist Party, whose job was to train workers to see their exploitative state. Now, in opposition to that, or not necessarily in opposition, but in a different mode, Gramsci theorizes human subjectivity as constructed within a dominant regime, but through ideology and hegemonic practices. So another Marxist scholar who gives us a little more insights about the dominant and hegemonic aspect of power, and who actually cites in a footnote that he's using Antonio Gramsci's ideas, is Louis Althusser, right, in his famous essay, The Ideological and Repressive State Apparatuses. And in that essay, he explains one of the institutions of hegemonic production of human subjects. And he explains to us that there are two things a capitalistic society must do. It must produce commodities, and then it must also reproduce itself, the class system that exists in it, right? Who would do what work, right? And he says that that is achieved through the educational system. In any given capitalistic society, the educational system, through attrition at different levels, decides people's place in that given society. So what does it mean? Think of United States, a capitalistic society, almost a society in which no one can tell you this is your lot in life and this is what you must do, right? Why do people just are content at doing some labor-intensive jobs, some mid-level managerial jobs, some become doctors, some become engineers, and they see that as their lot in life because of the credentialing system, because of the education they had or did not have. So overall, if we rely on Gramsci's distinction between dominant and ideological power, the latter being hegemonic aspect of any given capitalistic society, we realize that in contemporary world then, capitalism itself relies on this kind of cultural hegemony. And how does it do that? I mean, think of United States and its economy. There is no group that doesn't or has not internalized that this is how the world works. Work itself has been elevated to a point where people take pride in working extra hours, right? And not working is considered something bad, something terrible. So already through the hegemonic project of culture to work, to rent our body or our mind has now become a sort of an automatic thing for people, right? And not renting our body or our mind is considered laziness. It's considered not being a good citizen, right? And there are other derogatory terms that people use for it too, right? So overall, then, the structuring of a capitalistic society, its strata of where you are, what you can aspire to, all of that has been normalized and internalized by people. So in Gramscian terms, then it has been inscribed on the souls of workers. So another inconsistency in consciousness of the labor, right? Becoming aware of their exploitation and actively seeking to change the system is this what Paulo Freire calls a fatalistic worldview. And that is not fatalism per se, but this idea that history by itself will march on to eventually change the world. What Freire constantly suggests and explains in Pedagogy of the Oppressed is that change comes through praxis. So workers' conditions will change if they collectively, actively seek to change their condition. Simply waiting for history to undo the historical injustices is impractical and is not likely to happen. So that means that the hegemonic project of capital has already incorporated us through ideology within its system of differentiation. We do what we do because of the education we got, or that we believe that somehow to work is virtuous in itself. So that's where the contemporary Italian Marxists are really useful for thinking through this. We already have kind of talked about how capital produces commodities, but also reproduces our subjectivities within it. There are also other things at play, racial and ethnic divisions, political divisions. All of these play into keeping us divided. But some other sides come from Franco Berardi, right, who is also a compositionist Italian Marxist. And Berardi talks about the 1960s counterculture movement and Vietnam War protests. And he explains that at that time, the fight was refusal to work. So people actively decided they didn't want to be part of the capitalistic project. That was the mode of resistance. But in contemporary capitalism, there has been a shift, and the shift ought to be about two things. One, how to define wealth, right? And that, according to him, is access to leisure time and not material wealth, right? How much of an access do we have to have time for pleasure, right? For rest, for doing things that we love. So that's the fight. And the fight for wage equality, that our labor should be rewarded in a way that it's not so lopsided against what the CEOs and others make. So wage equality in a way and access to leisure time is sort of the fight of our times. Now, overall, capital or capitalism has been able to establish itself as a sort of hegemonic project in the world, especially neoliberalism. So what is neoliberalism? I mean, I have detailed videos on it, but it's basically a belief that free markets are good, that free movement of commodities will make sure that everyone can access them, right, and has access to free capital as well. But what they don't talk about in that process is that the free movement of labor is still not possible, right? So we have kept commodities and capital, they can move freely, but labor is fixed in place. When you fix labor in place, then you can cheapen it. So the fight there then has to be not just free movement of capital and free movement of commodities, but also free movement of labor. Also, in the global fight, then the fight has to be about not just a cumulative regime of capitalism. And this comes from John Ripley, that in neoliberalism, capital will increase. Corporations will keep making more profits. Those who have more money will make more money through investments. But it's the distributive function of capitalism which is reduced and almost diminished. And what was the distributive function of capitalism? To have safety net programs to make sure that everyone has a fair chance at a good education, healthcare, retirement. These programs now have been privatized and connected to our idea of self as individuals. So if we retire and we don't have enough to live on and the state doesn't do much for us, we have internalized this idea that maybe we have failed, right? We don't ask whether or not our government is responsible to take care of us when we are old and infirm, right? That has been sort of wiped out of our consciousness because of our focus on individualism, because of our focus on this idea that me alone am autonomous and I have choices, and if I make wrong choices, I have to pay for it. So overall then, I mean, this has been a hastily recorded lecture, right? What we then understand through Gramsci is that the state doesn't always work as a coercive institution, and that most of the time it works through hegemonic projects. Now, that hegemony is established through willing consent of the people, but that consent is not individually given, but rather ideologically obtained. So people buy into these ideas that they are responsible for their actions. They are the ones whose lot it is to work as laborers and as intellectual workers, and then they maintain the logic of capital itself through their actions. And that precludes any idea of revolutionary thought or any idea of thinking critically about the system in which we exist. So overall then, there is a need, as Gramsci would say, of organic intellectuals, of intellectuals who don't just explain the system, but also explain and discuss alongside people who live the lived reality of oppression and poverty in the world, who explain why is it that there is so much stratification in the world, and why is it that some people have so much and majority of people on this planet have so little, right? And undo this idea that they have so little because they haven't done enough, but rather they have so little because a small minority is keeping most of the planet's wealth in terms of nations, but also individuals. So these are some thoughts that I have off the cuff coming from Antonio Gramsci, going through some other Marxist and Franco Berardi. I highly recommend reading the Prison Notebooks, but also Franco Berardi's The Soul at Work. I have a few lectures on it on my channel. You're welcome to watch them. But overall, thank you so much. I hope this is useful to you. Let me know what you think. And as always, stay safe, take care, and I will now see you next time. Until then, peace and love.